Burnt Offerings, Chapter 3. The voices were in the hall just outside the closed doors, Walker's and the cracked rasp Marion remembered hearing on the phone Monday. "Where do you want this stuff?" "In the car. Where else?" "There's no more room in the car." "Well, make room. What do we pay you for anyway?" Ben had gone out onto the terrace to check David, who was amusing himself, safely and in plain view, at the foot of the lawn, away from the water, as Ben had told him. When he re-entered the room, he said, "He's fine," but Marion was holding up her hand and nodding in the direction of the voices. The knob was turning and one of the doors moved a bit. Marion cleared her throat. "And take that mirror out too," the woman said. "It's cracked." "Not the only thing around here that's cracked," Walker replied. Ben snickered, and Marion was trying hard not to smile. The door was pulled shut suddenly, and whatever the woman retorted was muffled to a small paragraph of sibilance. When it finally flew open, a small, energetic woman in her early 60s walked in briskly. She was sharp-faced with highly lacquered pepper and salt hair. Her outfit, dark blue, was tailored and expensive, and she wore a double strand of pearls. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, extending a jeweled hand to Marion and then to Ben, almost as an afterthought. "But I've had a morning." She looked toward the hall and then raised her voice. "Some people just don't know which side is up anymore." There was no reply, just a distant shuffling in the hall. "Old fool," she muttered, and then turned abrupt to Marion. She smiled sweetly and said, "I'm Roz Allardyce. Brother will be down soon," as he pulls himself together. Marion let Ben make the introductions. Before he could mention David, Miss Allardyce said, "There's a boy, too, isn't there?" "Oh, yes, our son David," Ben said. "He's gone down to look at the water." "Is that all right?" Marion asked. "Sure, let him romp," Miss Allardyce said. "Kids are good for the place. Anybody else?" "Just the three of us," Ben said. She remembered speaking to Marion, remembered the name Rolf, even though she was bad at names, and besides that, had a head full of names at the moment. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the ad appeared last Sunday. "I keep forgetting how many folks there are who want to get out of the terrible city." "There's been another people?" Marion couldn't help asking, and if Miss Allardyce hadn't been watching her so closely, she would have pantomimed an apologetic "sorry," too anxious to Ben, but she was watching her like Walker. "Other people?" Her voice broke on the laugh. She cut it off, and the voice became low and confidential. "The wrong kind, most of them." Marion tried not to look at Ben, who was jerking his thumb in his and then Marion's direction and nodding. "We're very particular, brother and me," Miss Allardyce continued, touching Marion's arm for emphasis. "We don't do this that often to begin with. Last time was 3 years ago. I forget. Some years there's nothing but wrongos and others." She smiled, her makeup flaking in the crevices, and let her hand slip from Marion's arm. "But it's still available?" Marion asked, and this time she made it sound less anxious. "Oh, it's available," she said after a pause, and to Marion it was clearly an invitation. Ben moved closer to them. "I suppose we ought to get down to particulars," he said to Marion. "A practical man," Miss Allardyce said, still looking at Marion. "Just like brother." She finally turned her attention to him. "Particulars are simple enough, Mr. Rolfe." She waved her hand over the room. "What do you think of it, the old homestead?" Ben followed her hand. "This?" "That's right, this." The question was unexpected. He thought a moment, nodded, impressed, and said, "Well, it's quite a place." "Indeed, it's that. Over 200 acres, and a lot of it prime waterfront property. Where do you see that nowadays? And the old barn itself, well, I'm sure Mrs. Rolfe appreciates something this special, right?" Marion let her eyes travel over the room as though she were seeing it for the first time. "It's extraordinary," she said quietly. "Your kind of house, am I right?" "Anybody's, I think." "You'd be wrong. Not anybody's." She flickered her forefinger against a red sandwich vase, which rang. "Knowing anything about antiques?" A little, Marion said. Then you've got some idea what's in here. The house is crammed with them. Her voice became soft and reverent. Our mother was really a great collector. She paused and seemed to go within herself. Our sweet darling. It's just lovely, Marion said, and her words were full of sympathy. Miss Allardyce composed herself with a deep breath, more like a sigh. Her face became sharp again, a ferret, Marion thought, and the bark was back in her voice. Hell to keep up. Too much for two old wrecks like brother and me, especially since the accident. They were spared the tangent by the quick shuffling sound out in the hall again, and the course that old fools no help, been senile years now. She raised her head slightly and yelled, Walker! The shuffling stopped. Something was muttered, and then he appeared just outside the door, struggling with a large carton, a lamp and a shade, dismembered, lay on top. What now? He asked testily. Brother's gardenia plant next to the window. What about it? In the car, please. It's dead. Right now. She closed her eyes. Her face reddened under the makeup, and her voice shook just slightly. Whenever your busy schedule permits. Her eyes opened as Walker shuffled past the open door. She shook her head ruefully. A crime. Just a crime the way things go around here. Brother's greenhouse used to be something miraculous. Now, not even a plant. The responsibility of a place like this, too much. Too much. At least she was aware of it, Marion thought, whatever that was worth. And maybe the old lady's words, which seemed to be addressed directly to her, triggered it, the strange proprietary feeling that came over her again, the feeling that this house, which she had never seen before, was somehow reserved for her. It showed, obviously, something a little deeper than blank awe and less objective had crept into her face, because Miss Allardyce looked straight at her and said, I know you're thinking what you could do with it, aren't you? Her accuracy made Marion's color a bit. Did she look that hungry? I'm afraid I am, Marion said, and gave Ben a helpless shrug. My wife, Ben explains, putting an arm around her, is the type that clips pictures out of House and Garden. You know, like other ladies cut out paper dolls. She's got an album filled with them. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there, Miss Allardyce said, until the royal thing comes along. Nope. He gave Marion a warts and all squeeze and then released her. You were getting down to particulars, Marion reminded him. He heard the please and said, About the cottage, Miss Allardyce. I'm afraid we have something a little different in mind. Cottage, she replied. What cottage? The one down the drive, the old shanty. That's the one. She looked at Marion. Well, what is he talking about? It was confirmation and relief enough for her to say very sincerely, We assumed it was the college you were renting. Who wants an old wreck like that, Miss Allardyce said distastefully. It's the house we're renting. And then to Marion with a nudge in her voice, You knew that, didn't you? Marion looked at Ben innocently. Oh, he said, and the disappointment was to her clearly token. Well, that solves that. Miss Allardyce drew her head back and looked at him over imaginary glasses. There's nothing wrong with it, is there? She asked, a little affronted. Nothing at all, Ben said. It's just a little more than we were looking for. Then that makes it a real nice surprise, doesn't it? It's that all right. He let her see how impressed he was, giving the room a long, appreciative look. But not for us, I'm afraid, right, babe? Marion hesitated. This ad did say reasonable. She looked at Miss Allardyce for corroboration. Oh, very reasonable, as I recall, she said. And so it is, for the right people. Well, who are they, Ben asked. Miss Allardyce paused, and her small eyes, watery blue, became calipers. Oh, a nice young couple, she said casually, with imagination and muscle. Someone who'd love the place the way Brother and I do. She waited and watched Marion. He was weighing it and all the probability whatever he said would come out suitably thoughtful and cautious and inevitably negative. Marian had been through it before. Miss Allardyce hadn't, and so she said diffidently, assuming that was, what would reasonable be? He reacted with a Marian, honey. There's no harm in asking, is there, darling? Something like this is way over our heads, he said. It's an estate, it's 4 walls and a roof, Miss Allardyce said simply. You know what they say about nothing ventured, Mr. Rolfe. My husband is maddeningly practical man, Miss Allardyce. All right, Bed said with resignation. In the interest of peace, 4 walls and a roof. Let's talk about them. Good, Miss Allardyce said. Now there is, of course, a few preliminary questions. Marian nodded and looked at her anxiously. We're talking about the summer. You'd be willing to take the place all season. Whenever to Labor Day? We could, Bed said, a non-committally as possible. Terms over June 20th? Ben's a teacher, Marian explained with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. So let's round it off to July 1. How's that? Give Brother and me time to get things in order. Fine, said Marian, she added, isn't it, to Ben, who shrugged a tentative yes. And there's just the 3 of you. Is that right? You 2 and the boy out there? Her voice had assumed an official tone, as though she were reading off a questionnaire. Marian waited for Ben to reply. When he nodded, she said to both of them, 4, really. There's Aunt Elizabeth. Think how she'd enjoyed this, Ben. We were talking about it this week, the idea of her getting out of the city. Who's she? Miss Allardyce asked. Ben's aunt. How old? The question surprised her. She let Ben say 74. Oh, an old gal, then, she thought, and then asked Marian, you wouldn't mind having an old gal around? Trick question, possibly. Despite the energy and the lacquer, there was lots of crepe hanging on Miss Allardyce. No, not at all, she answered, and honestly. Some people would, you know. Oh, no, Aunt Elizabeth's a doll. Miss Allardyce paused. The question was obviously important. Well, that's very sweet, she said. Very sweet indeed. Her voice had been surprisingly soft. It rose again, inquisitorial. Just 4, then? No other family? Ben was leaving the preliminaries to her. Ben's parents are dead, she said. Yours? In Florida. Miss Allardyce grimaced at that. A sister in California? Okay, 4. She seemed disappointed. Is it important? Marian asked. Oh, not necessarily. It's just that there are more than 30 rooms here. It can take a heck of a lot of people to make a house this size come alive. There are just 4 of us, Ben emphasized. A house that size was exactly his point. Absurd. Marian wondered if they'd seen more of the 30 rooms. Oh, no matter, Miss Allardyce said. We can close most of them off. And Marian could hear herself saying, the west wing is closed. We'll have to put you in the east. Grandly. It's the quality that counts anyhow. Miss Allardyce said and smiled. Not that it's important, but pets. Oh, none, Marian said. Good. Brother can't abide them. I'm sure you could provide references? Yes. Oh, not necessary. Brother and I made up our own minds. She moved a little closer to Marian. What's more important, Mrs. Rolfe, is that you be willing to stay and tend the place as far as you could. Maybe even bring some kind of life back into it. Would you do that? The voice had suddenly become less impersonal. There was even something of a plea in the last words. She looked at Ben. All of you? She was waiting. It seemed to him more for a commitment than a reply. Well, that's a pretty big order, he said. We're used to an apartment. Small, hot, and noisy, he added for Marian's benefit. We wouldn't know the first thing about running a place like this. Oh, it takes care of itself, Mr. Rolfe. Believe me. What I meant was, how shall I put it? She stirred the air with one hand and found the words. Would you love it the way Brother and I love it? She stopped and became meditative. And our darling, of course. Again the reverent pause. That's all. The rest comes naturally. When he started to say, yeah, but this kind of responsibility, Marion said, of course we would, very quietly. She reached for his hand and pressed it. He returned the pressure hard enough to make her wince. It seems to me, Miss Allardyce began slowly, working out the figures in her head, we're talking in the neighborhood of 700. She looked up, underlined the figure with a firm nod, and waited for them to react. A month, Ben said. Oh, a month? Heck no, she said, vastly amused. 700 for the summer. For this? The figure had surprised him. Enthusiastic with Ben made Marion close her eyes in relief. The house and all 200 acres. The pool, the beach, the works. Now, is that a deal? Her expression had become almost philanthropic. We'll take it, Marion said. It came out like a great sigh. She squeezed Ben's arms. Won't we, darling? She pleaded. Won't we? Please, please. It's certainly something to think about, he was going to say, but there was a sudden noise in the hall, a metallic clattering and the low buzz of a motor. Brother, Miss Allardyce announced. The motor stopped, then started again. Told you it was reasonable, she said, listening for the right people. Again the buzz stopped. The clattering, louder now, was coming from the staircase, which Marion remembered had a metal track running up its base. Walker! A phlegmy voice boomed. Walker, for Christ's sake! Heck, Miss Allardyce shook her head. Brother's stuck on the damn inclinator again. Walker wheezed past the open door, called, Hold your damn horses, I'm coming. Get me off this goddamn contraption, Brother yelled. His voice rattled and broke into a fit of coughing. The motor was buzzing on and off. Miss Allardyce rolled her eyes, said, Excuse me, quickly, sweetly, and started to leave the room. It's moving, Walker was saying. It's moving up. I want down, your horse's ass. Miss Allardyce turned in the doorway, raised a hand to her mouth, and whispered, He's a cripple, defensively, in the hall. Walker said, You got a filthy mouth. She slammed the door shut behind her, cutting off the sound. Unbelievable, Marion said immediately. An absolute steal. There's no question in there, darling. We have to grab this. 700? Oh, my goodness. Something had come to a thudding stop in the hall. Ben hunched his shoulders and said, Jesus. Marion shook him insistently. We'd be crazy not to take this. In that case, we fit right in with the rest of them. Pay attention to me, she said, steering him away from the noise outside. You can't tell me you're not impressed. 700 for 2 months? For 200 acres of land and a mansion? Are you crazy? I'm impressed, he admitted. Then it's set. Tell them yes and give them a goddamn check. Let's hear a little more, hun. Why, for God's sake? They're handing it to us. You don't find that it's a little suspicious? Not at all. If they're crazy, then it's a nice crazy. And those qualifications, taking care of it, is going to take a little bit more than love to keep something like this up. Let me worry about that, Benji, she said, whimpering. I love you too much to divorce you. Really, I do. The doors were opened. Himself killed one of these days, Walker was saying. I wouldn't talk, Brother said. The way she bangs around in that sawed-off jalopy. He rode into the room in a wheelchair, a plaid blanket covering his legs. He was puffy and pallid, with thin red-gray hair covering a freckled palate. His eyes were bulging and red-rimmed. Miss Allardyce followed him, saying, I confine my driving to the open road. She looked over her shoulder and said, Scram! To Walker, who disappeared, grumbling. Brother steered the chair toward Ben and Marion. Mornin', he called, a little breathlessly. Miss Allardyce introduced them. Her brother's real name was Arnold, and he was full of beans today. I'm always full of beans, he says, a chuckle rattled around in his throat. You're the folks going to take care of the house, are ya? His hands were very white with large, disgusting liver spots, and extraordinarily cold. We've just been getting the details, Ben said. Like Walker and Miss Allardyce, brothers seemed to be studying Marion especially. "Oh, I like 'em, Roz," he announced after a moment. "I like 'em." "There's only 4 of them," Miss Allardyce said, lowering her voice. "An aunt and a boy, too. The boy's down at the beach, and the aunt's an old gal." "Oh, really? Good enough," Brother said. He spun around, skirted a Boule writing desk and some old leather-bound books on it. Their spines broke and curling and came to a stop just inside the open terrace doors. He squinted down at the beach. Some distance to the left of the wooden pier was a small rock jetty with rows jagged about 5 feet above the strip of the beach. David was climbing dangerously on the rocks. Brother narrowed his eyes, and the boy's figure became clearer. He grabbed onto a rock, started to pull himself up, and then drew his hand away suddenly. He fell, and by squinting even more, Brother could see him slide down the surface of the jetty, his arms flying out for support. Brother's face remained impassive. David was in the dark sand, one knee clasped to his chest. He was rocking back and forth, his head thrown back in pain, soundlessly. Brother watched a few seconds longer, with Ben and Marion silent behind him in the middle of the room. "Aw, cute little feller," he said. "What is he now, 6 or 7? 8, Ben said. "Oh, lovely, and full of the devil, I expect." Brother chuckled appreciatively, and then, aware of Ben approaching the window, he wheeled around quickly to face them. "He shouldn't be wandering around like that," Ben started to say, but Brother raised his hand limp and said, "He'll be just fine. Just fine." He wheeled himself through the narrow passage between the desk and the wing chair, forcing Ben to the center of the room, blocking his view of David on the beach. "He's very good, really," Marion said. "All I have to do is tell him what's out of bounds." She caught Ben's eye. "If," she said to him hopefully. "They've been kids here before," Brother said. "Never any problem with them." "Part of what I was saying about choosing the right people," Mr. Allardyce said. "We've never been wrong yet. Have we, Brother?" "Nope." He reached into his pocket of his robe, heavy flannel over pajamas buttoned to the neck, and pulled out a ragged tissue. "Do you rent every summer?" Marion asked. Brother was blowing his nose and turning paler. "It depends," Miss Allardyce said. "Last time was when Brother held up 2 fingers weakly, his nose grinding into the tissue. "Every other year's the way it usually works out," Miss Allardyce said, watching Brother with some annoyance. "Like I said, it depends. Some years it worked out better than others." Brothers lowered his hand. His eyes were wet and redder. "Our rest and recreation's what Roz here is talking about," he hastened to say. When he smiled, his dentures clicked. "I'm coming apart, as you can see." "Oh, Brother," Miss Allardyce said. "Oh, Brother is right." He shook his head tragically, then summoned the strength to say to Ben, "Roz has given you all the details, I expect?" "Yes," Ben said. "Including the price?" $700 for the summer. He said it flatly without the enthusiasm Marion would have put into it, so she quickly added a spirited "yes." Brother brought his hand down on the arm of the wheelchair as he glared at Miss Allardyce. "'Scuse us a minute," he said, and pushed the chair against his sister, nudging her away from them. "I told you to ask for 9, he whispered hoarsely. Miss Allardyce looked uneasily at Ben and Marion, who were watching them. She leaned closer to Brother. "It was 7 before." "Well, that was 2 years ago. Brother will lose them." Brother smiled at Marion. "Her, not a chance. 9. "Why, for God's sakes, we don't need the money." He was looking at Ben now. "7's too low. He's suspicious type. Can't you see that, you old fool?" "All right." She moved away from him and, not all convinced, said, "If you say 9, then it's 9. She came back to them smiling guiltily and looked mortified. "Have I messed it up? Have I ever messed it up?" She looked back at Brother, who had not moved. He shoved her out with a jerk of his hand. "Something's wrong," Marion said, alarmed. "Well," she said, "Brother here's the business of man of the family, and What is with everything gone up these years and days? I mean, you know yourself. He says, it's 900 for practically 2.5 months. Just give the price, Roz, brother called out pleasantly. 900, she said firmly, and waited. That's a bit of a jump, Ed said. More than we planned on spending. They hadn't, as far as Marion could remember, decided on any figure, as if 700 was a steal, which even Ben would have to admit. Then what was another 200? 3 weeks at an office, temporaries? If it came to that, or behind a counter somewhere anywhere, would he really get mad if she said it? He'd get over it sooner than she would if he just turned them down. And so she said, it's still a bargain, let's take it. Look, Ben said, and there was an edge to his voice under the grim. Why don't you go sit in the car, hun? Of course it's a bargain, brother said, wheeling back to them. Where would you find a place anything like it? With all that land, all of the space. He swept his hand toward the window, surprisingly energetic. Never mind the land. Look at the house, Roz said. When have you ever seen a house like this? It goes on, brother said. They were beside each other almost imperceptibly. Their enthusiasm was moving them towards Ben and Marion. Rooms and rooms, ones we don't even know about that are here. Basements and sub-basements. Oh, a marvel of a house, Miss Allardyce exclaimed. An absolute marvel, thanks to our mother. Brother nodded. Roz passed her hand over the surface of a table. Just look at this room. Look at the treasures in here. Just to live with them, Mrs. Rolfe. Ain't it worth it? Marion stared at them silently. And God, brother, Miss Allardyce said, when it comes alive, tell them about that. Tell them what it's like in summer. Oh, sister, they wouldn't believe it. His hands leveled the space in front of him. It's beyond anything you've ever seen. Look at it, for God's sakes. Look at the character of that place. Miss Allardyce shook her head ruefully. And where do you find character nowadays? Nowhere, right? Their voices had risen. Miss Allardyce was holding on to Brother's wheelchair. Still they were moving forward. Take it, Mr. Rolfe, Brother said. Take it. How on earth can they resist it, brother? Look around. Look at what the years have brought to the stone and to the wood. There's centuries in these rooms, Mrs. Rolfe. This house, why, it's been on this land longer than anyone can remember. Isn't that right, brother? Far as we know, it's always been here, brother said. And believe me, it will be here when we're all kicked off. They were closer. Mrs. Allardyce's voice lowered and became almost hushed. It's practically immortal. I sincerely believe that. And so Brother said, so do I. They stopped staring at Ben and Marion, who remained very still. Marion could still hear their voices in the silence, which had become tense and uncomfortable to Ben. He broke it with a small, nervous laugh. Other things become equal, he said. I've been sold. We got carried away, didn't we? Miss Allardyce said apologetically. It's so easy, I suppose, when you love something as much as Brother and me love this house. We mustn't push it, Brother. We never do, Brother said. The house always sells itself. To the right people, Ben said to himself. And if it had been, yes, possibly a few minutes ago, it was closer to no probably now. They were watching him expectantly, Marion included. He stopped by looking thoughtfully over their heads at the far corners of the room. He tried to ask himself why. What was behind the vague uneasiness he was feeling? Not the 900 necessarily, and if there was enthusiasm was a little disconcerting. Well, they were eccentric to begin with. Was it the splendor of the house that he found intimidating? The fact that something so clearly beyond their reach seemed to be there merely for the asking? It was all happening too fast, and something he couldn't help feeling was being left unspoken. Mr. Rolfe doesn't seem to be sold, Brother said to Marion. But he can be, Marion said, and the threat, Ben was sure, was either playful or imaginary. Can't he, Mr. Rolfe? I'm waiting for the catch, Ben said, smiling. Miss Allardyce looked puzzled. Catch? You mean there's nothing more? Ben asked. 900 and it's ours? She nodded, half now, half at the end of summer, or whatever arrangement you and Brother decide on. Fine with me, Brother said. Agreed. There had been a look between them, very quick, which Ben caught. There is a catch, isn't there? He said, lightening in with a grim and wave of his finger. Brother was fidgeting, and Miss Allardyce colored slightly. Ben pursued it, saying, I thought there had to be something. Well, Brother said, red-faced, there is one other tiny little thing. Here it comes, Ben's thought. The graceful exit. Just please make it impossible enough to satisfy Marion. Miss Allardyce pulled back her shoulders and dropped the sheepish look. Hardly a cat, she said. Hardly, Brother repeated. He sat absolutely still, his white hands resting on the arms of what might have been a chair of state of an episcopal throne. The rattle was now longer in his voice when he announced, It's our mother. Your mother, Ben said, and Marion pulled out her hand to quiet him. Our mother, Miss Allardyce repeated, drawing herself up even more. What about her? Marion asked quietly. From what Miss Allardyce had been saying earlier, Marion assumed their mother was dead. Brother smiled and shook his head, lost in admiration. An 85-year-old gal, he said, who could pass for 60. Oh, 50, Miss Allardyce corrected him. God bless her, yes, she'll outlive all of us. A woman solid as... She searched for something to express it. This rock of a house, Brother said, rapping an end table with a wobble. Our darling, her voice filled the room. Miss Allardyce fell into position behind Brother's chair and rested her hands on his shoulders, her face directly above his. What Roz and me mean to say, Brother explained, watching their reactions very closely, is our mother, well... She never leaves the house, never leaves her room even. Isn't that so, Roz? Roz nodded. This house is just about all the world she knows. It's her life. And vice versa, Brother said. The whole thing would just come down without her. And so would we, Brother, Roz said. So would we. She patted his shoulders, comforting. That settled it, of course, as far as Ben was concerned. Surely even for Marion, there was no surprise, though, that he could see, no reaction at all, only rapt attention. Believe me, Miss Allardyce continued, to Ben especially, you'll never even know she's around. Never even see her, probably, Brother added. That's how quiet she is. That's how much she keeps to herself. He looked toward the ceiling and shook his head again, with wonder and affection. Our mother. Our darling, Miss Allardyce said. Marion was following their gaze up to the coved ceilings and trying to visualize the room somewhere beyond the plaster rosettes and the fan traceries that were speckled with gilt. And as she started to look at the ceiling, the hum of their voices, which had become low and soothing, hypnotic almost, brought out the exquisite patterns more clearly. She could see what the ceiling might have looked like in its full glory, the room, the house, and everything in it. It just kills us, Miss Allardyce was saying, going off whimpering. But would she have it any other way, Brother? Oh, course not, Brother said, and believe me, there's no use arguing with her. Delicate as she is, there's steel under it all. Miss Allardyce laughed lightly. Oh, we've learned that all right. Her word is law. Always was and always will be as long as she's with us, which is always, please God. Always with us, Brother repeated reflectively. For a moment the ceiling had become almost transparent to Marion. The pattern worked on her like a trompe-l'oeil. Brother went on, his voice growing softer, more inward, as though he were alone in the room. In her room all the time, he said, way at the end of the house, where you'll never see her, never ever know she's there. All you'd have to do is leave a tray for her, Miss Allardyce said, 3 times a day. Just put it out on the table in her sitting room. Never the bedroom, Brother cautioned Marian. It's kept locked all the time. Always, Miss Allardyce said, our poor, gentle, darling mother. The voices were blending. Mary can barely hear the difference now. What could be simpler? A tray in the sitting room 3 times a day, which she might and then again might not even touch. And for that simple catch, as you call it, Mr. Rolfe, Brother said, everything here's yours, with no strings attached. He repeated the words to Marian. They're yours. Her marvelous house, Miss Allardyce said, letting her eyes roam around the room. There's been here for so many years that she watched come alive and grow so many times when we've despaired, Brother and me. Mother is our pillar of strength to us, a tower of hope, our darling, our mother. Miss Allardyce's hands were tight on Brother's shoulders. She loosened them in the silence and then let them fall to her side with a long, weary sigh, keeping her eyes soft and distant on Marian and Ben, who remained motionless. Brother reached for his tissue again, and the sound seemed to call Ben back. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. The voices had worked on him like a moving point of light, a coin or a candle flame. Was it just him? The mind suddenly going blank again, like another car incident. He looked at Marian, whose eyes were wide and shining. She faced him slowly. Oh, I wouldn't mind, Ben, she said. Really, I wouldn't. She was saying that to the Allardyces as to him. It took him a while to collect himself, to wrench the sound of their voices from his mind. He covered it by looking even more thoughtful. When he was sure it would come out normal and even, he said, That's something we hadn't counted on. I suppose not, Miss Allardyce agreed. Marian kept silent. Obviously she had made her mind up. And you just leave her? Ben asked him. We've done it many times, Mr. Rolfe. There was a note of resentment in her voice. That's what keeps her young, Brother said. Why, if she thought Roz and me would pass up our trip this summer, she'd become an old woman overnight. Believe me, she would. She's that independent, that self-sufficient. Like Aunt Elizabeth, Marian said, thinking aloud. She looked at Ben and repeated it. Again, they were waiting for him to reply, all 3 of them. His impulse was to come right out and tell them predictably. Marian would surely think, thanks, but no, and assume that she would have sense enough eventually to see beyond the house and realize the absurdity of the whole deal. There was still something being left unspoken. He was convinced, something more than merely eccentricity to the Allardyces. But he recognized the look in Marian's eyes. The house had indeed sold itself to her instantly, and it would take more than a blunt no to dislodge it. We'll think it over, he said, as sincerely as he could, and let you know, okay? But Ben, Marian said, grabbing his arm, no pout this time. It was genuine protest. He didn't bother to lower his voice. Marian, the responsibility of an, he caught himself, elderly woman. For this, she broke in, almost embracing the room. For all of this? Brother nodded confidently to Miss Allardyce, who looked away from him quickly. You won't even know Mother's here, she insisted. I promise you, she stays in her room all day, sleeping most of the time, Brother said. And when she's not sleeping, she's working on her collection. Right, Brother? He agreed. Oh, yes, her pictures. Old photos. She's got thousands of them. The memories of a lifetime, Miss Allardyce said. Oh, it's her hobby, Brother explained. Like mine's is my music. Miss Allardyce's voice dropped. What music? She asked. My disc. My record collection. Oh, that. She waved it away. Give him his Mantovani and his whatchamacallits. Roz here's got no hobbies. Roz has no interest at all. Some people are too busy and being useful for hobbies. They have moved apart for the bickering. His hobby, she said to Ben, is his health, his eternal health. You just watch it, Brother said in a fit of coughing that Roz mention of health seemed to have triggered. Just watch yourself. She looked away from him. The people last year, she said, and Brother corrected her with, 2 years ago, dummy. The coughing fit was passing. Roz glared. 2 years ago, she said. They didn't see her once. The McDonalds, Brother remembered fondly. Wonderful family, Miss Allardyce said. The voice was rising again, and she was moving back behind Brother's chair. Or the time before, as I recall. Brother straightened in his chair, the rattle in his throat gone. The Donchis, another wonderful family. They were all Roz, all of them. The Wazoffs, Miss Allardyce smiled. Oh, and the Nortons, Brother. Remember them, how dear they were. Two-Eye and the Spearings. The names kept coming on. The names came at Ben and Marion, a whole litany of them that Roz and Brother were calling up with mounting and almost childish enthusiasm. Oh, the Constanzas, the Caps, the Whipples, the Fergusons, Thorne, Zori, Abelman, Wright, Griffin, Loomy, Costello. They stopped abruptly, and Roz and Brother seemed lost in meditation for a moment. Wonderful families, all of them, Brother said, and Miss Allardyce nodded and said, oh, just wonderful. There was a silence. And now, Brother said quietly, Rolf? Miss Allardyce repeated the name like a prayer. Rolf. The announcement, small-voiced and whining, came from the open terrace door, wrecked the silence. I fell. He limped 2 steps into the room, holding up his arms and displaying 2 scraped elbows. His jeans were torn, and his left knee, gaped through, were ragged and bleeding. The shock took a while to reach Marion. When it did, it jolted her. She cried, David! And ran to him across the room. Oh, darling, what happened? She was on her knees in front of him. My God, baby, what happened? I fell, he repeated shakily, and her reaction brought on the tears. Ben was beside her examining the wounds. Okay, sport, easy now. He raised the scraped elbow gently. Easy. Marion had her arm around David. Is he all right, Ben? Is he going to be all right? You want to wash out those cuts, Brother said. He then wheeled himself close. Miss Allardyce snapped her fingers. Bring him this way into the kitchen. Their voices, the rasp, and the rattle backed, were filled with concern. Oh, he's all right, Ben said. Aren't you, Dave? I fell on the rocks, he said to Marion, where all the sympathy seemed to be. She had taken out a Kleenex and was wiping his elbows, wincing along with him. I told you, she said to Ben, he shouldn't have been left alone. An accident, that's all, Brother said, leaning forward to say. Roz here's got a first aid kit. Go get it. Come on, Dave, alley-oop. Ben lifted him, and Marion grabbed his hand. What's a few cuts, after all? He held him tight and moved toward the door to hurry Miss Allardyce. It hurts, David cried, and Marion said for Ben as well, I know, baby, I know. They followed Miss Allardyce out of the room, leaving Brother, who heard Marion say, I'm sorry, to Roz. We should have been more careful. Brother waited until the voices disappeared and then wheeled closer to the window, pulling his robe closed at the neck. Light was moving above the water like a nimbus, blinding him in the opposite shore. In a while, something shuffled behind him. What's all the hubbub? Walker asked. Brother didn't turn. They were perfect. The woman especially. A natural. Boy got hurt, he said to Walker. Serious? Oh, he'll live. Walker came to the window. He stopped beside a pedestal supporting a large gardenia plant. They're taking the house, he asked casually. Brother shrugged. Of course they're taking it. He's never been wrong yet. We'll see, he said. Walker lifted the plant, which was stiff, brown, and leafless. Brother turned his head. Where are you going with that plant? Out to the car. Why? He nodded in the direction of the door. "Hoosie says it was dead." "Oh, did she?" Brother faced the bay. "Look again." He said. The base of the plant just above the powdery soil was a pale green branch, and above it, on a dead branch, were 2 new fresh shoots. Walker looked at Brother's back, then at the plant again, re-examining it. "Now ain't that something?" he said.